All right, the first logical fallacy that we're going to discuss is called ad hominem. Ad hominem is a form of argumentation which basically attacks the person who makes the argument instead of attacking the argument itself. The most common form of this is, especially at the middle school level, some type of personal insult. The lunch lady thinks that I should stay in line and not cut, but she's ugly and she's got a wart on her nose, so I can ignore it. Now, in this form, that obviously sounds pretty silly. But if you think about it, it's not all that uncommon, you know, oh, such and such is ugly, such and such wears glasses, such and such has a certain style of clothing, stupid appearance, whatever, and therefore I don't have to listen to them. Well, it sounds very silly when you put it in this form, but this type of attack is not all that uncommon. You may unfortunately see racist or sexist comments. Well, you know, such and such has these qualities and therefore we can ignore them. Ad hominem attacks are a fairly frequent, low form of persuasion, for lack of a better word. The next one is ad populum. This one also very prominent for you at the middle school level. The fallacy that many people believe something, so it has to be true, because after all, lots of people believed it. The simplest refutation of that I could give you is that once upon a time, everybody was absolutely sure the world was flat. How'd that work out? The example I've got written here, 75% of Americans say that if they saw someone with a shaved head, a jean jacket, and ripped pants on, they know he was a troublemaker. So that means you're a troublemaker. Well, just because somebody prefers a particular fashion sense does not automatically label them a troublemaker. But it's very common for people to make that assumption based on people's appearances, based on something about them, and ad populum reflects that. The assumption that lots of people believe a thing, therefore it is truthful, you can rely on common knowledge, sure, but it's very dangerous to never challenge assumptions simply because they're widely held. Next one we're going to talk about is appeal to dubious authority. And by the way, if I'm going very quickly, remember you can pause me and rewind me to have another go. An argument which uses someone of dubious expertise to support their claim. Typically by middle school, we don't tend to run into this fallacy quite so much anymore, but it's very common in younger ages. You may have a little brother or little sister who uses this fallacy all the time. Well, mommy says da 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 da, so, and it continues from there. The example I've got here is, well, my dad says the Empire State Building is made of granite and gold, so it must be. Well, unless your dad is a structural engineer who maybe had a hand in designing the Empire State Building, he is probably not an expert on this subject and therefore not an authority. Now, if on the other hand, a marine biologist or an oceanologist said something about global warming and rising saline levels in the water and all this, that would be an example of a real authority who actually knows what they're talking about, as opposed to dubious authority. The emphasis on dubious authority is, here is someone who may be an authority figure in your life, they may be an important person, but they have no expertise in the field. That makes them a dubious authority. For example, if I were to tell you about something in English, that makes me an authority on it. If I were to tell you about something in math, well, I'm brilliant, so I'm still, no, kidding. Next one. Next one is appeal to common practice. This is an argument made which states that because a lot of people do something, it must be the okay thing to do. It is in some way similar to ad populum, that a lot of people believe something, it must be true. The appeal to common practice basically says, well, everybody does it, I can do it too. Or it's okay for me to do it too. In the adult world, the most common forms of this are people who speed or people who slide through stop signs. I mean, after all, everybody goes 10 miles over the speed limit. That makes it okay. Well, no, it still means you're breaking the law. A lot of people may feel that that law, in breaking it, the risks are acceptable for the consequences. That's a personal decision for them. But that doesn't make it okay just because everybody's doing it. If everybody made a habit of bashing themselves in the head with a hammer twice a week, that wouldn't make it any smarter to do. At the teenage level, it's a very common justification used for cheating. Well, everybody else cheats, so it's okay for me to cheat too. Well, no, it's still against the rules, it's still dishonest, and it's still cheating you of a good education. But a lot of people, they see what everyone else is doing, maybe some peer pressure involved, they're doing it, so I have to do it too. That's another reason peer pressure is bad, because just because something is a common practice doesn't mean you should do it too. Next one, also very common at the teenage level, appeal to emotions. If you feel very, very strongly about something, it's very common for people to not be willing to listen to reason about it. Well, unsurprisingly, that is a logical fallacy. Just because you feel very strongly about an issue does not change the rightness or wrongness of it. Now, most times when someone feels very strongly about something, it's not a good idea to point it out to them that it has no effect on whether or not they're right, but it doesn't change the truth of the matter either. One of my students says, well, I really, really hate homework, so getting rid of homework, that must be the right thing to do. Well, I'm sorry you really, really hate homework, but guess what? It still has a place. You may also run into in political or religious debates, debates about economics, really debates about government or any major human entity. You're going to run into people who feel very, very strongly emotionally about it, and so as a result are absolutely convinced of the rightness of what they believe. Next one is appeal to fear, also known as appeal to threat. If any of you or your parents have ever watched those old mafia movies, it'd be a shame if something happened. That's appeal to fear. The idea is that someone is going to be coerced to agree with you because if they don't, something unrelated that's bad might happen. Now, that's different from a cause and effect relationship. If we keep heating up the atmosphere, glaciers will melt, sea levels will rise, global warming, those are all things that perhaps, if they're true, we should be afraid of, but they're related to heating up the atmosphere, and so that's not appeal to fear. Appeal to fear would be something like our example. You should really loan my brother 50 bucks. It'd be a shame if something happened to your car, wouldn't it? That's appeal to fear. The issue of loaning the brother 50 bucks, does he have good credit? Is he likely to pay you back? Totally unrelated to the issue of what's the condition of my car. However, in appeal to fear, it's not exactly logical, but sometimes people use it. Personally, I'd loan him the money. It's your car. Now, this one you may need to rewind once or twice to get it, because it's kind of a circular argument. Nobody's going to get that one, but that's okay. Begging the question is, as I said, a circular argument. The idea here, and it's a little tricky, is that in order for you to prove your case, the thing that you are trying to prove has to be true. Watch how this plays out. I'm interviewing somebody, we'll call him Bob, for a job. I say, Bob, your resume here looks really good, but I notice you don't have any references. Is there anybody trustworthy that would speak on your behalf? And Bob tells me, well, sure, my friend Steve here, perfectly trustworthy. And so I say, well, how do I know that I can trust Steve? And Bob says, well, because I told you so. Well, the problem is, if I can't trust Bob, he's not going to give me a trustworthy friend. He's going to give me somebody who's going to back him up. And so as a result, Bob's reference is no good to me. I have to trust Bob to know that his reference is trustworthy. But if I trust Bob, then why do I need the reference at all? You might think about that the first time you apply for a job. They always ask you for a reference, but are you going to write someone down that isn't going to tell all the good things? Next one, biased sample. The idea here is that you're attempting to prove something and you're going to go out and poll some people or collect some data, but the polling or the data that you use is biased. It's not a legitimate, fair sample. For example, my writing here, obviously cheerleaders are very intelligent. I went out to all the cheerleaders on the honor roll and asked them all some questions, and they all got them right, so they're all very intelligent. Well, that's true, and not to denigrate cheerleaders, I have several very intelligent ones in class, but the way that sample was conducted isn't very fair, because you took all of the cheerleaders who are already confirmed to be relatively intelligent. Typically, whenever we want to pull out a sample of something, we want it to be completely random. We'll take some of these, some of those, some of these, and not poke at any particular group, because the wider and more random the sample, the more honest it's going to be. Imagine if you asked for an opinion poll on the president at a Republican National Convention. Well, that's not going to go very well. That's what we call a biased sample. All the people of one particular group are very likely to feel a particular way. So instead, we should pick random people all throughout the country if we're going to do that. That's how polls work. The same thing could be said if you were trying to collect scientific data. Well, I'm going to measure the temperature in Texas in the summer. Well, if all of your measurements are conducted at midnight, it's going to look very different than if you measured at noon every day. You want to take a well-rounded set of samples. The next one we're going to talk about is called burden of proof. Now, burden of proof is a fun one because it can get very silly very quickly. For example, I will tell you now, right now, on camera, I have psychic powers. You don't believe me? Well, prove me wrong. Ha! You can't prove that I don't have psychic powers, so I must have them. Sounds silly, but that's how burden of proof works. The idea is that one side in an argument is saying, I don't have to prove myself right. You have to prove me wrong. Which really is kind of a silly concept. In the example we have here, I happen to know that Bigfoot exists. Well, okay, what's your proof that Bigfoot exists? Well, you can't prove that he doesn't exist. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't work out. But people do that in a lot of different ways all the time. Such and such cheated on the test. Well, no, I didn't. Prove it. Well, I can't prove it. So wait, does that mean they didn't cheat on the test? It doesn't mean that they didn't cheat on the test. It just means that I can't prove it. You may have heard the term burden of proof used in criminal cases, in American legal systems. The idea there is that someone is going to be innocent until the person accusing them fills a burden of proof and shows that they're guilty. The next one of my favorites, is confusing cause and effect. The assumption that because two things happen together, they must somehow be related to each other. Just because two events happen at the same time doesn't guarantee that they're related in any way. Every time Ben comes to school, he trips, he falls into a tree. Therefore, going to school makes Ben clumsy. Well, the reality that we don't know, because we don't know all the factors involved, is that every time Ben comes to school, he sees Susie, and Ben has a crush on Susie. And he trips and falls into the tree. Every day you can count on it. Unfortunately, we don't know that. So we just assume that Ben coming to school, he trips, he falls, so on, and such a sad day. A lot of times, whenever two things happen together, it's important to make sure there aren't other factors involved that are maybe causing both of those things. Just because two events regularly happen together does not automatically mean there's a relationship between them. Often there is. But you can't just say, same time, must be together. False dilemma. Now, some of these you may notice that your parents on occasion use. False dilemma may also be another one of those. We'll get back to that in just a moment. But just as a caution, don't necessarily jump to any conclusions about the uses of this information just yet. False dilemma is when an assertion or an argument says that there's only two choices here and you have to pick one of them, and that there's nothing else you can use, when in reality there may be lots of other options available. False dilemma can also be called an ultimatum. Now, usually in the home, you may run into these situations where a parent says, you can do this, or you can go to your room, or you can do this, or you will be grounded. Now that's not a false dilemma. That's called a parent exercising power. Power that they have and you don't. So sad for you. Now let's talk about gambler's fallacy. Gambler's fallacy is so named because gamblers are the ones most likely to fall for it. Gambler's fallacy is the belief that because a series of events has occurred repeatedly, something is going to happen which will cause the chain to break soon. For example, if I were to take a coin out of my pocket, flip it 49 times, every single time that coin comes up heads. What are the odds of that coin coming up heads one more time? I bet you thought it was 50-50. No, it's 100% because I'm obviously using a weighted coin. However, if it was a fair coin, the odds of that 50th flip being heads, still 50-50. The gambler's fallacy is the idea that because a sequence of unlikely events has occurred, something that is far more likely should happen soon. And statistically, that may be so, but betting on it is not wise. Very common form, I've been playing this slot machine for an hour, I haven't won any money at it yet, and statistically, people win money on a slot machine every hour. So I must be due to win money soon. Sounds crazy, but a lot of people have bought into it. Next one, appeal to tradition. And again, you might not want to throw these at your parents because they have power and you don't. Keep that in mind. Appeal to tradition is reasoning, which states that because we've done things this way, it's the old way, it's the traditional way, it must be the better way. We've been doing this way for 30 years and it's worked fine. There's no reason to change it now. Well, technically, if we go under that methodology, next time you go to the doctor, enjoy those leeches. Because once upon a time, leeches were the tried and true way of practicing medicine. And it's worked for hundreds of years, so why change it now, right? And wait till you see the pliers the dentist has for you. Now, genetic fallacy, a little confusing, so you may want to take a careful look at this one. Genetic fallacy is an argument based on the idea that the history of the person who gives the argument is tainted, and therefore that makes the argument tainted too. In a way, it's kind of like ad hominem, the idea that because something in the history of the person making the argument is no good, therefore we don't need to worry about the argument itself at all. I don't care what the people in that organization are doing today. The organization was founded by a bunch of thieves, so we can't trust them today. I don't care what that politician's doing now. When they were 4 years old, they were a member of the Ku Klux Klan, so we can't trust them today. Well, there are cases where the history of a person is very relevant, and depending on how long ago that history was, it may be relevant. Somebody who was part of a radical organization 2 years ago, that's a much bigger deal than someone who was in that organization 30 years ago. So genetic fallacy is basically the idea that because of something unrelated in the person's past, we can't accept their argument today. All right, we're going to cut it off here for section 1 just to see how this all came out. Check for the second video if all this works out, probably up with the same name with a little 2 by it. Hope you enjoyed watching.